Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.40, The Battle of New York. The loss of Long Island and Brooklyn Heights meant many things for Washington and the Continental Army. On the one hand, it is impossible for us to pretend that the loss of Brooklyn Heights was anything other than a defeat for Washington. However, a serendipitous rainstorm had given Washington enough time to realize that his position was untenable. A skillful retreat may have well saved the American army to fight another day. However, the Battle of Long Island was, in other ways, a turning point in the war. In many ways, it changed how Washington would view the war, and consequently how he would conduct it moving forward. This week, we are going to look at just how the war had changed, and just how this would manifest itself in New York as well as beyond. We will be looking at a, admittedly somewhat feeble, attempt at diplomacy between the British and the American representatives, before we end the episode today with the American evacuation from New York. Among the biggest impacts of the loss of Long Island came a general shift in just how the war was going to be conducted. It was not until after the loss of Long Island that Washington fully came to grips with the fact that the key to winning the war would not come through bold, large-scale strikes against the British Army. Instead, he realized that the war should be a defensive operation rather than an offensive one, something that Washington would deem the War of Posts. British leadership in North America had long feared this possibility. Bunker Hill had shown the price that could be extracted from the capture of a single fortified hill, and there were a whole lot of hills. Writing to John Hancock and the Congress on September 8th, Washington wrote of the situation that he faced in New York. He let the Congress know that many of his officers were advocating for the complete evacuation from the city, as it could no longer be held. He wrote that their intelligence showed that the British were working on encircling them and trapping them in Manhattan, cutting them off by the land to the rear, and using the Navy to cut off their retreat to the front. Washington writes, "It has been even called a war of posts, that we should on all occasions avoid a general action or put anything to the risk unless compelled by a necessity into which we ought never be drawn." Washington would further state that dragging the American troops out into battle against a superior British army was a fool's errand, and argued that the way of the war from this point forward should be the spade and the pickaxe. In that letter to Hancock, Washington had spent a lot of time defending this switch in strategy. However, as we touched on a moment ago, it made complete sense. Although we all love a good underdog story, and want to pretend that a scrappy bunch of Americans were going to be able to challenge the might of the British Army in the field, that simply was never going to happen. The British were superior in both skill and in discipline, something that Washington noted. However, the Americans did have a handful of advantages that they could use. Bunker Hill had been an example of the damage the Americans could inflict on a British army storming a well-fortified position. Winning individual battles was not that important, so long as the Americans would remain in the field and force the British to pay a heavy price for their victories. Critically, there is a key difference here between a war of posts and a war of retreat, one where the Americans just attempt to avoid battles altogether. Fighting from fortified positions prevented the Americans from having to meet the British in the open field, and gave the added benefit of providing protection behind those fortified walls. Washington hoped that this would be enough to encourage his men, fighting from the relative safety of cover, and would get his troops to actually hang around and fight. This gets us to one of the real weaknesses of the British Army. If the Continental Army could make the price of victory for the British expensive, they could theoretically gain an advantage in the greater overall conflict. Sure, the British had an impressive army and a world-class navy. However, moving an army across the Atlantic was a logistical nightmare, not to mention very, very expensive. William Howe was well aware of this and had been since Bunker Hill. We have discussed previously that Howe was reluctant to risk his army, and at times appears almost overly cautious. Most recently, we saw this when he decided not to pursue the retreating Americans on Long Island. This is not a remark, however, on the courage or resolve of Howe, but rather a realization of the pragmatic logistical challenges that he was facing. William Howe was reluctant to risk his army because he understood how difficult it was going to be to replace the men. When one of his men was injured or died, or in any way was unable to fight, the British faced a daunting uphill challenge to replace that man. Howe feared that should his army suffer a serious defeat, it could potentially end his ability to meaningfully conduct the war. In the book The Glorious Cause by Richard Middleton, he quotes a General William Murray, who was back over in Europe. I believe this sums up the situation perfectly. In the aftermath of Bunker Hill, Murray commented that the Americans' plan ought to be to lose a battle every week until the British army was reduced to nothing. It may be that our troops are not invincible. They certainly are not immortal. This hits the nail on the head. It explains the reason for Howe's perceived overly cautious attitude. The British could not afford huge losses in America if they hoped to continue carrying out the war. Should the Continental Army be able to remain in the field and conduct a war moving forward from fortified hill to fortified hill, the hope was that over time it would wear down the British resolve to fight. The war had meant that the British merchants were cut off from the lucrative American market. Should the government agree, begrudgingly of course, to American independence, it would mean the restoration of the much-missed trade. Not to mention that the longer that the war dragged on, the more it would cost the British in terms of both money and lives. At some point, hopefully, the British would grow tired of the expensive losses and the accompanying economic hardship, and would be willing to grant political independence to stop the bleeding and restore the trade. This concept was not exactly new either. Although Washington had, as recently as February, designs on taking Boston by force, the loss on Long Island seemed to have confirmed to him what he knew to be true, that victory would not come in decisive open field battles. This strategy was not lost on his officer corps either. Even as the Americans were reinforcing Manhattan, Charles Lee wrote that he was aware that the Americans would not prevent the British from taking the island. However, consistent with the new policy, he had hoped to make the capture of Manhattan as painful as possible for the British. Lee, as well as other officers, had hoped that the Americans would hold out just long enough to extract some blood before they withdrew from the island. None of this is to say that from time to time, Washington would decline to take an advantageous shot at the British. In fact, as we will see in just a few weeks, Washington is going to do exactly that at the end of the year. However, from this point forward, the war would be primarily a defensive engagement. It would be transformed into a war of posts. As Washington was coming to grips with what his real job was going to be, keeping his men in the field, an opportunity for diplomacy presented itself. The Howe brothers were the commanders of the British war effort. General William Howe commanded the army, and Admiral Richard Howe commanded the navy. However, just because they were presently engaged in a war against the Americans, does not mean that the Howe brothers had any personal animosity or hatred towards the Americans. In fact, really, the opposite was true. The Howe brothers had long remembered that their brother, George Howe, had died fighting alongside the Americans during the 7 Years' War, dying outside of Fort Corallan, something that we talked about in episode 3.33. If you recall, Howe had died in the arms of Israel Putnam, the same Israel Putnam who had just been in command over Brooklyn Heights. Following the end of that war, the Americans paid to construct a memorial to Howe inside of Westminster Abbey, something that the surviving brothers never forgot. The Howe brothers were well connected. Richard Howe was the head of the family, a position that he had held ever since his brother had died all those years before. Richard Howe had done a stint at the court of George III. Admiral Howe, despite these high stations, however, was never much one for politics. In fact, although he was now commanding naval forces in America, he had personally hoped to see the crown back down in their position towards the American colonies, wanting to see concessions made in order to preserve the empire. Although the leadership in London may not have been aware of Howe's views, they gave him a command and he intended to follow his orders. The ministry did throw the Howe brothers a bone, however, allowing them a limited amount of power to negotiate with the Americans. Although this was great on the surface, the ministry was also clear about the prerequisites for a stop to hostilities. They were demanding a full, unequivocal acknowledgement of parliamentary authority without any qualifiers or conditions. Towards the end of Benjamin Franklin's stay in London, in the period following his experience in the cockpit, Franklin would find himself spending time with the Howe's sister, as they found a friendship around playing chess. During these matches, they had talked about politics some, with the Lady Howe expressing her desire for peace and for Franklin to play the role of a mediator, while also acknowledging that his recent treatment by the leadership had been shameful. It was through these encounters that Franklin would also come to interact with Richard Howe, meeting him for the first time on Christmas Day, 1774. As was the case with his sister, Lord Richard Howe expressed his disappointment with how Franklin had been treated. As it turns out, Howe informed Franklin at the time that there was anything but a united front inside of Parliament on what to do about the American crisis, with a contingent being actively in favor of making the necessary concessions to preserve the peace. Chief among these allies was Lord Chatham, the former William Pitt. Now, of course, we all know that ultimately this will come to nothing, and that the peace most certainly was not preserved. However, the entire affair had helped to forge a friendship between Richard Howe and Benjamin Franklin. Although less than 2 years had passed between Franklin's meeting with Admiral Howe, so much had obviously changed politically. Admiral Howe, however, still had some interest in trying to restore the peace, and he had at least some, albeit limited, ability to try to achieve that end. He wrote to Franklin that he had the ability to grant amnesty to those who agreed to lay down their arms and accept parliamentary supremacy. Franklin, in a somewhat stinging reply back, informed Howe that the Americans would not be begging for forgiveness when they were the victims of the British evils. Howe was a bit taken aback by the letter. However, following the British victory on Long Island, he decided that it was time to respond. He sent the newly captured John Sullivan to Philadelphia with a new letter. Despite the less than enthusiastic response from Franklin, the Howes were requesting a meeting. Now, the Americans were not fools. They did not expect that these meetings would yield much of anything. Furthermore, the Howe brothers likely did not expect that much was going to come out of this. For both sides, it was more of a chance just to test the waters a bit and ideally open up a dialogue. In Congress, there was substantial debate over whether or not to send anybody at all. However, eventually the decision was made to send a 3-man delegation, consisting of John Adams, Edward Rutledge, and, of course, Benjamin Franklin. The 3 men would travel to New York for the meeting, taking only a brief pause in New Jersey, where Franklin and Adams got to share a room, much to the annoyance of Adams, who was a bit exasperated by Franklin's long-winded explanation of the necessity of fresh air while sleeping. Sleepless nights aside, the American delegation reached Howe's headquarters on Staten Island on September 11th. The American delegation, upon their arrival, was offered a British officer to hold as a hostage, a protection that they declined as a show of good faith. The American delegation was treated to a nice lunch, and by all accounts, things remained cordial. really cordial is about as far as anything would go. There was never much of a chance of any agreement being reached. The Howes were willing to offer terms, but those terms were going to be predicated upon the recognition of the complete and total supremacy of Parliament. The newly independent states had no interest in coming to terms that would have had them accept parliamentary supremacy. Howe went so far as indicating that it might be possible to return to how things were prior to 1765. However, now it was far too little, far too late. Edward Rutledge wrote to George Washington that same day that nothing had come from the meeting, and that Howe had failed to recognize the United States as being an independent state. Rutledge wrote that Howe spoke in generalities, promising nothing, but stating that the king would be willing to consider reversing the acts that had caused the Americans so much strife. Rutledge confirmed that nothing of substance came from the meetings, and that their future still rested in Washington's hands. John Adams wrote to Abigail that his biggest takeaway from the meeting is that Howe possessed no real power to negotiate, other than what was granted to him by Parliament. Nobody on either side had really expected a whole lot to come out of these meetings with Howe, and at the end of the day, those expectations were met. New York was lost. Everybody, including George Washington, was keenly aware of the fact that there was really no way he was going to be able to save the day. The British were in an advantageous position, and Washington was looking at the very real risk of his army getting stuck on Manhattan. His army had only narrowly escaped just a few weeks earlier from being caught on Brooklyn Heights, and now they risked the same fate yet again. Knowing that New York was a lost cause, Washington's attention immediately turned to the question of what to do next. Clearly, Manhattan needed to be evacuated. However, that brought with it its own complications. Once the Americans left New York, what was to be done with the city and its ample supplies? Do you leave it and allow the British to enter into a comfy winter quarter? Or do you burn it to the ground, destroying all of those supplies, and deny the British a comfortable winter, and then face the backlash of destroying one of your own leading cities? Part of the concern for Washington was that his troops had spent months working hard on setting up as many defenses in New York as possible. Now, Washington was suggesting that they should just pack up and walk away from all of this. He worried about the impact that this would have on the morale of his men. Congress was likewise hesitant to see the Americans just surrender New York without at least some fight. Both Howe and Washington seemed to realize that the real target was not going to be southern Manhattan, where the Americans were well dug in. From Howe's perspective, there was no point in landing to the south. Washington had done a good job of digging in, and risking the men there would be foolish. Rather, the better strategic point was to land further to the north and to attempt to cut off the Americans' ability to escape. Should Howe be able to cut off retreat to the north, and with Long Island no longer available, the Americans were at real risk of becoming trapped in southern Manhattan. With Washington trying to figure out what his next move was going to be, Congress helped him clarify his options, when they told him that if he needed to evacuate New York, he should refrain from burning the city. At a minimum, this confirmed to Washington that he at least had leave to evacuate New York, if need be. So far as the survival of the city, historian Benjamin Carp points out that although Congress had said they did not want the city to be destroyed, and that is how Washington interpreted it, John Hancock would inform Washington that he still had some flexibility to decide the fate of New York. Either way, Washington was working with a clear mandate that New York did not need to be held at all costs. Upon discussion with his officers, Washington became convinced that he needed to take some kind of action to protect the northern portion of Manhattan while evacuating his army from the city. Quickly, Washington began the process of preparing to evacuate from New York, when on September 12th, he sent men to take up a position at Kingsbridge, at the northern tip of the island, where the Harlem River hits the Hudson. By the 15th, Washington had moved the majority of his army to the north. I do want to make a quick note here on the geography of New York City in 1776. Today, we think of New York being, well, New York, a massive metropolis filled with skyscrapers and a population that expands well beyond Manhattan Island. In 1776, though, it was a different story. Back then, the city existed in the southern portion of Manhattan Island. It did not fill up the entire island. So when Washington ordered that the army move to the northernmost part of the island, that was effectively in order to evacuate the city. Meanwhile, with the diplomatic option now a failure, Howe immediately began making his own plans for an assault on the American position. Howe, as previously mentioned, had already decided that he did not want to mess with attempting a landing in the south, but rather that he was going to move further to the north, where Washington's defenses were lighter, choosing a spot at Kip's Bay. This location was not randomly chosen by Howe, but rather it was amongst the weakest points along the entire American defensive line, making it an ideal, if not outright obvious, place for the British to make their landing. On the morning of Sunday, September 15th, Howe moved into position in the East River. Joseph Plum Martin, a young soldier of just 15 years old, would describe his memories of the day. Martin describes sitting in a warehouse in Kip's Bay early that morning. Martin was flipping through some old discarded papers on the floor when, as Martin writes, all of a sudden, there came such a peal of thunder from the British shipping that I thought my head would go with the sound. I made a frog's leap from the ditch and lay as still as I possibly could, and began to consider which part of my carcass was to go first. As the Americans were in the process of evacuating anyway, those along Kip's Bay gave little resistance, instead moving to the safety of the West. This, however, did not thrill George Washington. Washington expressed his anger at the conduct of the American troops and their officers following the Battle of Long Island. He had been upset about what he had seen as a disturbing amount of cowardly behavior. Washington expected that his men were going to stand and fight, and yet as he raced to Kip's Bay to survey the action himself, what did he see? He once again saw his army failing to even attempt to hold their ground, and instead he witnessed them running pell-mell to the west. George Washington was not amused. The general did everything he could to turn around the mass of his army that was rushing towards him. He began striking at the men, officers included, with his riding crop. Washington raced his horse through the crowd, imploring the men to turn around, stand their ground, and fight. This situation was very nearly catastrophic for the Americans. There was no question that Washington had lost his temper, but very literally, he had become blind with rage. As he stood there expressing his anger, an aide spotted some 70 Hessians quickly moving their way towards his position. Despite him shouting warnings to Washington, he was clearly in a zone and was not hearing the increasingly urgent warnings from his aide. The quick-thinking aide moved quickly and all but dragged Washington out of there, away from the risk of capture and back to relative safety. In terms of fighting, there was nothing good for the Americans about what happened on the 15th. They had all but melted away in the face of British opposition. There was little attempt by the men to stand their ground, or by their officers to order them to fight. It was a mess. However, really, it could have been so much worse. Howe had expected that the American resistance was going to be much more fierce. Thus, the ever-cautious Howe chose a more conservative plan, rather than storming across the island and establishing a line from the East River to the Hudson. If Howe had taken that option, he may have been able to cut off the Americans still remaining inside the city, some 3,500 men, under the leadership of Israel Putnam and his aide, Aaron Burr. They were able to get the vast majority of those men quickly out of the city and move them to the north. Washington could be, and indeed was, as mad as he wanted to be. However, the events of the day had been nothing more than an embarrassment for the Americans, rather than the more substantial losses that could have been inflicted had Howe ordered a more aggressive pursuit. The next day, despite his disappointment from the day before, Washington got a much-needed pick-me-up. As Howe was wrapping up his victory and was busy officially taking control over New York City, Washington and his officers had grown confused about what Howe was doing, as reports became muddled. Joseph Reed offered to go out and take a look, which Washington approved. A short time later, Washington decided to head out as well. As he and Reed were trying to figure out what Howe's next move was, they heard gunfire off to the American left. What they found there was that some 300 British troops had descended on the American left at Harlem Heights. Adding insult to injury, their bugler was playing the sound, signaling a fox hunt. Washington, who was no doubt worried that the men were going to break and retreat, as they had done both on Long Island and the day before, was pleasantly surprised when the men stood their ground. Reed would later write that the humiliation of the call for a fox hunt was enough to get the men to hold their positions. A short time later, the British had to call for a retreat, moving back towards their newly captured city. The Battle of Harlem Heights, as it would be called, was not some huge victory. It was not Lexington or Concord, Bunker Hill, or even Sullivan's Island. In terms of importance, it was an insignificant skirmish in a war filled with insignificant skirmishes. However, for an American army that was truly reeling, it was a much-needed morale boost for all of the men, Washington among them. There had been rumors for months that Washington and the Continental Army were planning to burn New York. This rumor had enough people concerned that both members of the New York Assembly and the Congress had talked with Washington about the survival of New York. Even inside of the American camp, there was talk floating around of the plans of the American army to destroy the city, should they prove unable to hold it. As we discussed previously, it really was a double-edged sword for Washington. Burning New York would be a terribly unpopular move, something that would paint the Americans in a bad light, both domestically and internationally. The Americans were busy trying to build up both those things. They had to ensure that there was a common cause at home, and internationally, they were trying to prove to the world that they were now a legitimate power, just like everybody else. On September 21st, just 6 days after the Americans evacuated Manhattan, a small fire started in a wooden shed near a tavern down near the Battery. The fire quickly grew and became an inferno that would engulf more than a fifth of the city. The fire destroyed Trinity Church, the most recognizable and largest building in the city. The fire spread with such a fury that many of the people on the ground could not help but think that it must have been an intentional act. There were reports that the fire was springing up in multiple locations at once, with many reporting seeing several ignition points. The depopulation of the city would further exacerbate the fire, as many of those who could have potentially helped fight it had evacuated the city in the weeks and months prior to it. This included the city's watchmen, whose job it was to look out for just this kind of situation. When the fire came, the normal protocols for fighting it fell woefully short, because everybody was already gone. Making matters worse, and helping to convince everybody that this fire was no accident. The firefighters who did remain in the city found that many of the pumps in the city had been broken, and the handles of the buckets cut. General Howe, believing that this entire thing was a ruse to draw the British into an ambush, hesitated at sending men from his ships into the town to fight the fire. In the aftermath of the blaze, the Americans were desperate to deny any involvement with the burning of New York. The British were just as eager to point the finger at their opponents. British reprisals in the city were brutal. There are multiple reports of people being caught with matches by the British troops during the fire, who would then just throw the suspected arsonists directly into the flames. Per historian Benjamin Carp, in his book The Great New York Fire of 1776, A Lost Story of the American Revolution, he points out that the British too were trying to stave off a public relations disaster by instead emphasizing the good work done by the officers to ensure that summary executions did not take place. This, of course, lends a degree of credence to the idea that people were indeed tossed unceremoniously into the flames. What would follow in the months to come was a flurry of accusations against people in the town and towards the American army. Among those who were implicated included such notable people as Abigail Adams' brother, though little evidence exists to actually make this anything more than an accusation. In another, slightly ironic twist, in one instance, a man named Abraham Van Dyke was accused of helping to set the fires. The accuser of Van Dyke was a local man who may well have been a slave. It is impossible not to think of the irony of the situation here. We are only 35 years removed from the events of 1741 in New York, a topic that we talked about back in episode 3.17. Many of the people in New York would still have had memories of the black men and women who had been burnt alive when a wide-scale conspiracy of a slave rebellion swept through the city. For an American army that was proclaiming its innocence, there was not exactly much remorse moving through the men. They had lost New York just days before, and seeing it burn was not an unwelcome development. Indeed, despite the public denials, many inside of the army did in fact believe that it had been their compatriots who were responsible. What the Americans did, therefore, was launch a campaign to paint the fire in a more favorable manner. Instead of worrying about things like who was to blame for the actual blaze, they focused on the British treatment of the rebels who remained in the city. Don't focus on the fire. Instead, pay attention to those summary executions and people being thrown into the flames. This plan, led largely by Washington and Joseph Reed, sought to control the narrative and redirect people's attention. For George Washington, the plan of the day was going to be making sure that he maintained a state of plausible deniability. If Washington knew anything about how the fire had started, he was not about to share that knowledge with anybody. Despite these denials of responsibility, Washington did not seem terribly disappointed that the city had burned, and actually seemed a bit annoyed that so much of it had survived. The British would still be able to use it for winter quarters. Really, though, the American campaign to control the information regarding the fire was successful. Sure, people still suspected that the American army was responsible for the destruction. However, they were incensed at the British mistreatment of the citizens of New York. Plus, they could not exactly prove that the Americans had started the fire. There was no proverbial smoking gun, just a whole lot of hearsay and noise. If the Loyalists thought that the fire would be a boon to them, sucking away support for the rebels, they were soon to be disappointed. Nobody really believed that the New York fire of 1776 was just an accident. The Americans had been talking about burning the city. There were British witnesses who claimed to have seen Americans taking action to achieve that end. And even afterwards, there were plenty of voices inside of the United States recognizing their involvement. It simply was not possible for the Americans to have done all of these things and then deny any involvement in what had happened. The British themselves would throw around accusations, but were always having to tread carefully, as they were not interested in answering for their treatment of the arson suspects in New York during the fire. The question of if Washington himself gave the orders to set the fire is more of a point of debate. Washington certainly did not seem disappointed that the city had caught fire and burned, and indeed had expressed that he strategically supported burning the city. However, he had been ordered by Congress not to burn the city, and he would ultimately deny responsibility. However, as Benjamin Carp points out, it is not as though Washington had complete control over his men. Discipline problems were a real issue, so it is certainly not out of the question that the fire was a rogue action from his men that occurred without the need for direct orders. If you have found this discussion about the New York Fire of 1776 interesting, I do highly suggest the book by historian Benjamin Carp. The book is again called The Great New York Fire of 1776, A Lost Story of the American Revolution. I used it very extensively in this portion of the show today, but can assure you there is a whole lot more in there, and it is an absolutely fantastic read. At the end of the day, the Americans had done a good job of refocusing the attention of the country on the British atrocities, rather than attempts to place blame for the fire. The entire incident stood as an exclamation point on a late summer that had seen the Americans pushed first from Long Island and then forced out of New York City entirely. However, these events had also helped to redefine what the fighting of the American Revolution would look like. The transformation into a war of posts had officially begun. Next time, we are going to pick up and look at what the Continental Army did following their loss in New York. Would the Americans be able to turn their fortunes around in the fall? Until then, I hope you all have a fantastic 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as the Americans attempt to stop the bleeding.